In theory, stakeholder engagement should ensure that development adequately considers the negative consequences that might affect the community and provide some level of remediation. In practice, however, stakeholder engagement in Toronto can feel singularly focused on blocking any new development. But what if we could find a new way to pursue development in communities? One which actually enables local neighborhoods to view development as an opportunity, not as an opponent. That's what I spoke about with Cheryl Case and Dan Seljak of the Coalition for Responsible Community Development. Coalition launched last November, and they're calling for councillor candidates to pledge to include community-led projects in the 2027 city budget. Cheryl Case is the founder and executive director of the Coalition. She is an urban planner and in 2022 was selected by U of T's School of Cities as its inaugural early career Canadian urban leader. Dan Seljak, returning guest, is an urbanist who publishes under Another Glass Box, a multimedia project covering Toronto, architecture, and urban life. That conversation now. Okay, well, thank you both for coming on to the show today. You're both here talking about the Coalition for Responsible Community Development. Cheryl, could you give a quick pitch of what the goals of the organization are?
To share with the city and other folks, our elected representatives, community expertise on the need to fund community-led planning.
And Dan, why do you think that's something that's necessary right now? What have you observed in the current engagement process in planning that makes you believe that there's some room for adjustment, a need for adjustment?
We've talked a little bit before about this, but kind of what my off-the-desk work for the last few years has been about trying to get people excited about growth and change rather than resenting it. And I think a lot of that resentment comes from the fact that it feels very top-down and it feels very opaque. So the kind of thesis is if people had closer proximity to the levers of how their community is planned and how it's going to grow, they might actually be a little more excited about growth.
And I understand that you have a specific proposal that would help communities pursue more exciting urban activities and activations. Could you speak about that?
We're looking to see the city invest in community-led planning for 15 neighborhoods in the 2027 budget, and then scaling to all 158 by 2030. And we know this is possible. We're looking for the funding to be up to $500,000 per neighborhood on an annualized basis, so folks aren't having to scramble every year or for every project to get funding. They can actually just focus on the work. This $500,000 seems like a lot of money. It actually really isn't. Although we can get a lot done with that. To compare, just in the last city budget alone, 2026 budget, the police budget was increased by $94 million, which is about $750,000 per neighborhood. So this would actually cost less, and it's really about helping to solve the problems to prevent the need for crisis response. And again, not every neighborhood would get $500,000, right? So that's what our ask is. Funding 15 in 2027 and scaling to all 158 by 2030. And of course, no one's going to stop them from going faster than that. And then our next set of asks is that the funds are actually governed by the people in the neighborhood. There are a lot of amazing people in every neighborhood. I'm sure folks can think of a number of names in their own communities. Garden clubs are an example, tenant associations. People are doing amazing work already. So if we enable them to actually decide on how funding would be moved, we'd be able to get a lot done as well. And then the last piece is that city's program around funding community-led planning is actually co-designed with community, right? So the city is going to be the funder. The residents, people who live here, should be part of that designing process.
Dan, could you talk about why you think that's important for this to be a bottom-up approach towards community initiatives versus something that's being determined from the city top down? I mean, some skeptics might say that it makes more sense. These are the city is integrated. People travel from place to place. Why shouldn't it be something that these sorts of funds are exclusively allocated by big city government?
I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons. The primary one, honestly, is that the way that the city is governed since Doug Ford combined wards together to have the size of council is that, now more than ever, councillors are not as familiar with the neighborhoods within their own ward. What this allows for is kind of a granular case-by-case application of funds from the people who know the space best. And it takes some of the pressure off councillors who are frankly overburdened. And again, going back to this idea of community engagement, there's a lot of research and all this other stuff about how in a workplace engagement as a metric is kind of a metric of how productive the workplace is. And I haven't done a huge deep dive on it, but I think that like it's only logical that if people feel engaged and connected to their community, they're going to invest more of their own money in it. They're going to spend more time there. They're going to take pride in what they do. And, you know, we've seen this in Regent Park, for instance, where Regent Park TV and other programs are really thriving in a model where the community is deciding, you know, which of these programs are most important, how are they going to evolve. The importance I see of it is just there's nothing else that provides that level of granularity. And so why not create something that provides extremely customizable granularity catered to the residents?
People feel so out of touch right now in municipal politics, but maybe if we provided a real opportunity to get actively involved, not maybe taking, you know, an hour TTC commute to City Hall, but by, you know, walking out your own door and participating in your own sidewalk and making adjustments, you could maybe inspire a greater buy-in to the political process more broadly and encourage interest.
One other thing I'll say just really quick is like, and I think Cheryl can speak to this as well, is, you know, Cheryl and I, me through my activism and Cheryl through her professional work, are people who are proactive and go out into our community and want to kind of build communities and grow things. But unfortunately, like one of the ways that people currently engage with their neighborhoods is typically through neighborhood associations that tend to be only about protecting home values and sometimes blocking future growth and development. And, you know, there's a place for that. But I also think that if you give people an opportunity to actively decide how their neighborhood's going to grow, it would create a sense of engagement that's a little more, I hate to say inclusive because it's kind of a buzzword, but it's a more open and more community focused way of engaging. If you're looking to build with other people, it can provide a direct incentive to keep economies and cultures growing within neighborhoods.
Cheryl, can you think of a specific project, maybe a certain initiative done by the city where you felt as though that engagement was lacking, where you felt like the on-the-ground community wasn't getting the kind of representation that might have improved the actualization of such a project? Does any specific example come to mind for you?
You know, when folks hear about this idea of funding community-led planning, they're like, well, the city already has this. They have the strong neighborhood strategy. But the strong neighborhood strategy is actually very different. And that strong neighborhood strategy, it is, I think it's like a 10 or 12-year-old strategy that's being, you know, renewed. I think it's in its third cycle now. Identify neighborhoods that have the highest level of unmet needs. It could be in housing, could be in economic opportunity and well-being. And the city comes together and brings a table of them together and supports folks to implement solutions to those problems, right? And so I think that that program is on the right track, and what the coalition and what, you know, the community's recommendation to the city would help that program to do is actually scale to reflect the level of need, and then also establishing and maintaining the type of relationship with residents that will enable them to solve problems. When you have city staff and community in the same room, there's a need to have established trust, right? And oftentimes those spaces, community members don't necessarily feel that the city is going to receive community input and implement their requests to shape their neighborhoods. So those spaces oftentimes don't have the actual capacity or you know, function of mobilizing actions in the way that folks are needing them to be action. And then the other thing is that that program provides funding for community-led projects, but it's $5,000 grants. So you can apply for a $5,000 project, and, you know, what is $5,000 going to do for you, right? It won't do very much. That's why we were looking to have it be annualized funding at a substantial scale where you can actually bring in folks and have a multi-year strategy. Because when you're looking at, you know, the housing crisis, the economic crisis that we're having of, you know, businesses being pushed out of spaces, there's a huge need for more, you know, urban farming or childcare and all these kinds of other things, even, you know, arts and cultural things. That's what the community-led planning would be able to address. That coordination and that community building is like folks being able to talk to their neighbors. This is something that I experience when I talk to other folks, is folks don't get to have that strong feeling of community. It's a lot of houses in a neighborhood, and a real community is one where you actually know your neighbors' names, and you have opportunities to collaborate and to have fun together, build together.
And it feels very tragic where in the absence of effective engagement, when budget is maybe allocated towards some of these projects and they're not as effective as they could have been, the response is, well, then we should not fund any project. Well, no, it's because you didn't listen to the people who were actually going to participate in this initiative. Dan, you're looking for pledges from city councillors and mayoral candidates. Has there been any positive response from that so far? What are you hearing from the political field?
Yeah, I think so far we've got a number of people who have signed on who like the idea. I think, this idea is relatively low cost with, it's hard to measure the precise benefits because so many of them are intangibles, right? It's about social benefit, it's about health benefit, it's about, crime prevention, but a lot of those are going to come after a few years of implementation if you're going to follow how this has been done elsewhere. So it's not going to be an overnight thing, and some of those are going to be affected by 100 other, the economy, cultural trends, various other things. So it's kind of hard to place in that way. There will be kind of a level of qualitative assessment. So I do know that there's some hesitation there. But on the other hand, when it comes to what constituents actually want, I was at City Hall on Wednesday, actually, and the Chinatown Land Trust was there in force to talk about what the plan, again, this kind of top-down plan from the city was doing and the fact that they felt it didn't meet their needs. Well, one of the reasons it didn't meet their needs and what city staff were kind of getting, there's this push and pull. The city staff were like, well, this type of plan doesn't provide the things you've asked for. And the community is like, well, that's what we need. And so if the city is only able to provide saws when the people need hammers, what the community development plan allows is for people to get the hammers, right? Like it's this kind of fail safe for when the kind of rigid structures of the city's apparatus either fail to meet the needs of people, or some might say deliberately keep them out if you're feeling a little fiery. It is a kind of pressure valve, I guess, when you have people who are feeling like the systems that are already in place don't serve them. And I do think Little Jamaica is a good example of a highly pressured environment where a thing that was out of everyone's control happened and was delayed extensively with the LRT. There wasn't sufficient measures to help with displacement or to help to keep the community together. And again, if you have something that is the same every year and the community is kind of built already for that resilience, they can respond quicker than the city's slow-moving machinery might create a solution.
And what I'm most excited about from this is the opportunity for experimentation and for a lot of learning to be done very quickly. Projects which are originating from City Hall can be very caught up in, a lot of very baroque rules that stymie the pursuit of anything that doesn't have 12 consultant reports that guarantee it's going to be in the economic best interest. And I think when you see the most exciting examples, the most vibrant areas of a city, is when it's the person who was walking by and said, I think that this should go here, and they tried it out. And the reality is, sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes projects fail. But you can never know if it's going to be this amazing new thing unless you're willing to try. And I think by lowering the scale, it doesn't have to be some citywide project when we make these changes. It can be something that originates on the community. It means that maybe we'll be a little more willing to experiment and a little less motivated by fear and, wanting to hold on to the inertia. Of course, we see the example of Church Street pedestrianization. That was a project that originated by a planning student, Rodney Chan, which led to a citywide framework to pursue additional pedestrianization of streets. You can only imagine, should you two be successful in this project, the amount of innovative community activities and projects that might arise because they are coming from people and communities who have never had the chance to even dream about what exciting things can happen in their community. For that reason, I really appreciate what you two are doing on this project, and I wish you both all the best. I think that is probably a good place to wrap up here. Cheryl, where can people find you? Any plugs, anything you'd like to promote? I'll, of course, include any links to the CRCD in as well, but anything else you'd like to promote?
Yeah, sure. So definitely, the coalition website, so crcd.to. Love for folks to visit. You'll be able to register at the bottom of the page and get notifications on if candidates in your ward have signed the pledge. And also, any mayoral candidates have signed the pledge, so you can do that at the bottom. They're all being sent the invitation, so we'll be able to share updates very soon on that. And in addition, I guess you can follow Community in Public on Instagram, and then also communityinpublic.ca. I do a lot of organizing work. In particular, you'll see that organizing taking place in Little Jamaica. And also we have an award-winning research project that is posted on the website. Some great work that I did with ULI Toronto and the City of Toronto, looking at the displacement of Black residents from neighbourhoods. So you can take a look at that if you want to kind of dive deep into some of the barriers and opportunities and to address displacement.
I'll have to have you back on sometime, Cheryl, to talk more about that because, I'm going to be very curious to learn more about that. And Dan, yourself?
Yeah, I can be found all over the internet as Another Glass Box, which is my kind of documentary and photography project. Kind of in keeping with this theme of bottom-up related stuff. I've got 2 little kind of micro docs, kind of social media size, coming out in the next little bit. One is about the art exhibit that was outside of St. Stephen's in the Fields recently that was done by members of the cleared encampment there. And then the other is about a partnership between an organization called 2 Steps Home and Building Up, where folks who are kind of at risk communities are taught trade skills, building tiny homes that are then implemented as the first step in the 2-step process of moving people from encampments to the 2-step home community and then into a long-term affordable house or housing. And so it's this kind of 2-step model that also is combined with skill sharing and upskilling. It's a very interesting little piece, and I'm looking forward to sharing both of those.
Amazing. Dan, Cheryl, thank you so much for everything you're doing, and I wish you all the best. Thank you for listening to Toronto, the Politics, the show. The show is hosted and produced by me, Christopher Chesson, aka the Canadian Curtis Sliwa. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a review on your preferred podcast app. You can find us on Instagram at Toronto, the Politics, the show. Have a great day, everyone.